Today, we're going to trace a line that starts with a simple idea, a Cold War theory, and see how it plunged the United States into one of its most divisive conflicts. But this is more than just a story about a war. We're going to see how the Vietnam War didn't just change a nation, it actually rewrote the rules of power for the American presidency itself.
And it all began with this one simple but really powerful image, a row of falling dominoes. This single idea, this fear of a chain reaction, became the justification for a massive, decade-long commitment of American lives and resources.
But the consequences, well, they went far beyond the battlefields. The fallout from the war forced this huge constitutional reckoning, leading to new laws designed specifically to rein in the very presidential power that had been used to fight the war in the first place. So how did we even get here? I mean, why Vietnam, of all places? Well, the entire justification really boils down to one single powerful concept, the domino theory. This was the central fear for President Eisenhower. He basically argued that if South Vietnam fell to communism, it wouldn't just stop there. Nope. Next would be Laos, then Cambodia, Thailand. You see, in Washington's eyes, the entire region could just topple, and that would be an existential threat to American interests. And you have to understand this wasn't just some abstract idea they cooked up. The fear felt very, very real at the time. I mean, look at the recent history. Mao's communist victory in China was fresh in everyone's mind. The brutal Korean War had just drawn these hard battle lines. And then, when the French were defeated in Vietnam, it really seemed to Washington like that first domino was already starting to wobble. And this, right here, is where we see the central tragedy of the war. The U.S. saw Ho Chi Minh as just another pawn in a global game of communist expansion, a puppet of Moscow or Beijing. But on the ground, for many Vietnamese people, he was a nationalist hero who was fighting for independence, first from the French, and now from another major foreign power. This complete misunderstanding would have absolutely devastating consequences. So you've got this mix of fear and misunderstanding, and it created a really dangerous situation. It paved the way for a small military involvement to spiral completely out of control, all because of one single event that basically handed the president a blank check for war. So under President Kennedy, the U.S. starts sending military advisors to South Vietnam. But let's be clear, that term, advisors, is pretty misleading. By 1963, there were 16,000 of them, and they weren't just training troops. They were deeply involved in combat planning and actual operations. The U.S. was already in way deeper than most people realized. And then you have the flashpoint. The official story that came out was that North Vietnamese patrol boats launched this totally unprovoked attack on U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. But later on, accounts revealed the details were murky at best. And that second reported attack, it might not have even happened. But that didn't matter. President Johnson seized the moment. In response, Congress overwhelmingly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And this right here, this is the moment the balance of power just completely shifts. It wasn't a formal declaration of war, but it might as well have been. It gave the president the authority to use military force however he wanted, with no need to go back to Congress for approval. And the result of that blank check? Well, just look at this chart. The number of U.S. troops absolutely exploded. We go from about 16,000 in 1963 to over 400,000 just 4 years later. America was now in a full-blown, large-scale war. Okay, so as the massive U.S. military machine geared up, it became pretty clear pretty fast that this was really a war on two fronts. You had the brutal, unconventional conflict in the jungles of Vietnam, and then you had this increasingly difficult battle for hearts and minds right here back home. On the ground in Vietnam, there was a total mismatch. The U.S. military was built for conventional, head-on battles, taking and holding territory. But the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, they just refused to fight that way. They used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, booby traps, and these incredible, vast networks of tunnels to avoid America's superior firepower and just inflict a constant, draining toll. Meanwhile, back in Washington, this was the official story you'd hear. At every press briefing, generals and politicians kept projecting this relentless optimism, assuring the American public that, hey, we were winning and victory was just around the corner. But here's the thing. Vietnam was the first televised war. And every single night, Americans were seeing images of brutal combat, wounded soldiers, and civilian suffering that just flew in the face of the government's rosy narrative. This disconnect between what they were told and what they could see with their own eyes created what became known as the credibility gap. In that credibility gap, it was about to become a chasm, because in early 1968, a single, incredibly audacious military campaign would completely shatter the official story for good. It became the war's ultimate turning point. The Tet Offensive was this stunning, nationwide surprise attack. Now, militarily, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces fought it back, and they inflicted huge casualties on the North. But you know what? That didn't matter. Politically, it was an absolute disaster for the U.S. The sheer scale of the attack, hitting cities all over the country and even breaching the U.S. embassy walls, it proved, beyond a doubt, that the enemy was nowhere near defeated. So after Tet, that official narrative was just broken beyond repair. That whole light at the end of the tunnel thing, it was exposed as a lie. Public support for the war just plummeted. And President Johnson, seeing the writing on the wall, went on TV and announced he would not seek re-election. The political will to win this war was just gone. The shock of the Tet Offensive, combined with all these years of growing distrust, it really set the stage for the war's final act. And this act wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the halls of power, where Congress would finally move to reclaim the authority that it had given away years earlier. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the press. And this wasn't just some rumor. This was a secret, internal government history of the war. It confirmed everyone's worst fears. It showed with documented evidence that multiple administrations, going all the way back to the beginning, had consistently misled the American people about the war's progress and the real reasons we were even there. That was the final straw. Congress, feeling like it had completely failed in its constitutional duty, finally acted. They passed the War Powers Act, even overriding President Nixon's veto to do it. And its goal was simple: to prevent another Gulf of Tonkin resolution from ever happening again. It put a clock on the president. You can act fast in a crisis, sure, but you can't wage a long-term war without coming back to Congress for their explicit approval. So while Washington was grappling with these new rules, American involvement on the ground was finally winding down. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, but without direct American support, the South Vietnamese army just couldn't hold on. And in April 1975, Saigon fell. After decades of fighting, the war was over. The war left these deep scars, but it also taught some incredibly important lessons. It showed the limits of military might when faced with a determined nationalist movement. It proved that in the age of television, public opinion is a decisive front in any war. And it served as a brutal lesson on the dangers of misreading a local conflict through a rigid, global ideological lens. And all of that brings us to today. The War Powers Act was forged in the fire of Vietnam, designed specifically to rein in a president's power to wage war. But in a world that often seems to demand swift military action, a critical question remains. Does that 1973 law still provide the meaningful check on presidential power that it was designed to be? That's a vital question to keep thinking about.